Hello friends, this video on excretory products and their elimination part 10 is brought to you by examfear.com. No more fear from exam. So now we will talk about the next step, that is reabsorption. So what happens in reabsorption? So now the filtrate has moved into the Bowman's capsule. So almost 99% of the filtrate is reabsorbed by the renal tubules. That is so interesting. So it says that, let us suppose some amount of blood has entered into the glomerulus, and out of that some amount of filtrate has entered into the renal tubule. So renal tubule starts with the Bowman's capsule. Now whatever amount of blood has entered, let us suppose if 100 milliliter of blood has entered into the Bowman's capsule, it says that by the time it reaches towards the end of the renal tubule, that is by the time it reaches towards the end at the collecting duct, almost 99 milliliter will be reabsorbed. Only 1 milliliter will be left out, and that 1 milliliter will be excreted out as urine. That is so very interesting, that so much of the filtrate is going to get reabsorbed while it passes through all the parts of the renal tubules. But that is what actually happens. Now, what are the substances that get reabsorbed? That is the question. Now, the useful substances are reabsorbed by the epithelial cells of the tubules and sent back to blood. Now, once the filtrate has reached here, okay, now these are the tubules. Now these tubules have epithelial cells on their lining. Now what happens is, as the filtrate moves down the tubules, what happens? It gets, the useful substances get reabsorbed by these epithelial cells, and then these epithelial cells send them back to blood, so that blood can again circulate them throughout the body. Now, what do I mean by useful substances? What kind of useful substances am I talking about? Now, useful substances can be something like glucose, it can be sodium ions, it can be amino acids, it can also be water. Now, we want to throw only the excess water, but if the body still needs some amount of water, then some amount of it can be absorbed from this filtrate. So these are some of the useful substances. Now what happens to the rest of the substances? The rest is all waste. And what are the wastes? These wastes are mostly the nitrogenous wastes like urea. These wastes can be urea, uric acid, ammonia, creatinine. These are all the nitrogenous wastes, and they need to be thrown out of the body. So now the question is how the reabsorption happens, how the useful substances are reabsorbed, and how the wastes are absorbed from the blood and sent to the filtrate. So here you can see the useful substances are taken from the filtrate and sent to the blood. So these are the blood capillaries. The red and blue ones, they represent the blood capillaries. So here if you see, the useful substances are taken from the filtrate to the and sent to the blood, whereas the waste materials are taken from the blood and then sent to the filtrate. So these waste materials can be anything, urea, uric acid, NH3. Now how this transportation happens? The transport of useful substances take place by active transport. That is at the expense of energy. Some energy input is given to move those substances from the filtrate into the blood. And how are the wastes transported? They are transported by passive transport. That is without any expense of energy, as per the concentration gradient from high concentration towards low concentration. The wastes will move from the blood capillaries into the epithelial cells of the tubules, and then from epithelial cells they will be put into the filtrate. So these epithelial cells, once they get the waste products, they will then secrete the waste products into the filtrate later. So that is how the wastes will be transported. And what about water? How is water transported? Water will also be transported by passive transport, that is without any use of energy. Passive transport means no input of energy. The transportation will take place from region of higher concentration towards region of lower concentration. So this is how water will move by passive transport. So that means water will move from the dilute filtrate into the concentrated blood, because if you talk about these blood capillaries, the blood in these capillaries have come from the efferent arteriole, which contains the concentrated blood. So the water concentration is more in the filtrate when compared to the concentrated blood. So water will also move from the filtrate into the blood. So this is how the process of reabsorption will happen. So it is a two-directional, two-way process. That is, useful substances will move from the filtrate into the blood, and the waste products will further move from blood into the filtrate. And as a result of, towards the end of the process of reabsorption, we will see that the filtrate contains all wastes. Mostly it contains all wastes, and there are no useful substances present anymore. Water moves under osmotic pressure, as I said, that is, it moves under the phenomenon of osmosis from region of higher water potential towards a region of lower water potential. So this is how the process of reabsorption takes place. So in simple words, the urine formation occurs in this way, that blood enters into the glomerulus, blood gets filtered, and then the filtrate passes through so many coiled tubules where useful substances get absorbed, only the wastes are left over. In fact, it is also checked that there is no further wastes left in the surrounding blood, so that they can also be sent to the filtrate. And finally, the filtrate contains only wastes, and then it is excreted out in the form of urine. So let us look at the role of the different tubules in this process of reabsorption. So we'll start with the proximal convoluted tubule, that is the PCT. So what does it do? Now, as soon as the fluid or the filtered plasma comes into the Bowman's capsule, after that it enters into the PCT. Now, this is the place where the maximum amount of reabsorption takes place. That is, reabsorption of all useful nutrients, water, as well as electrolytes, everything occur here. You'll be surprised to know that almost 70 to 80% of the essential nutrients and water gets reabsorbed here. So, maximum reabsorption of useful things happen here. Now, presence of brush border epithelium increases the surface area for absorption. So here, this portion has brush border epithelium. Now, when you have brush border epithelium, they have cells like this, in the like how we have cilia, right? Similarly, you have brush border epithelium. Due to the presence of a brush kind of appearance on the outside, the surface area increases, and therefore the absorption increases. So that is about the proximal convoluted tubule. The next one is the Henle's loop. Now, as I said, Henle's loop has a descending loop and an ascending loop. What happens here? Now, there are two characteristics of these two loops. The descending loop is permeable to water, that is, it allows passage of water, but the ascending loop does not allow passage of water. So the ascending loop allows passage of the electrolytes. So that is the characteristic of the Henle's loop. Now, minimum reabsorption occurs here, not much of reabsorption. Then what happens here? However, they play a very important role in osmoregulation, that is, it maintains the water and ionic balance very well. Now, how does it do that? Now, as the filtrate comes down the PCT, it moves into the descending Henle's loop, descending limb of Henle's loop. Now, in the descending limb, what happens? This descending limb is permeable to water. It is permeable to water. So it allows water to pass across, but it doesn't allow electrolytes to pass across it. So as the filtrate moves down the descending loop, what will happen? Water tends to move from the filtrate to the outside, right? So the filtrate tends to become more concentrated, because anything which loses more water will become more concentrated. So that means as the filtrate moves down the descending loop, what happens? It loses water. That's because the membrane is permeable to water. So the membrane allows passage of water from the filtrate to the outside. So it loses water, so the filtrate becomes more concentrated. So in the descending loop, filtrate becomes more concentrated. But when the same filtrate tends to enter the ascending loop, the opposite process happens. In the ascending loop, the same filtrate will tend to lose ions. So when it loses ions, it tends to get diluted. So as a result, the filtrate will become diluted as it goes down the ascending loop. Now let us suppose the filtrate moves up the ascending loop. So what will happen? It will lose ions. Now when it loses ions, it tends to become diluted. And in this case, it becomes more concentrated. In this case, it becomes more diluted. Now due to this movement of water and ions, it helps to maintain the ionic and water balance. And that is why it helps in the process of osmoregulation. So there is no major reabsorption here. However, they play a very important role in osmoregulation. We will also talk about this Henle's loop when we talk about the counter current mechanism. That is what motivates this movement of water and ions in the Henle's loop. What motivates it? What creates that gradient to cause this movement of water and the ions in the ascending and descending limb of Henle's loop? That we will take up in a separate topic a little later. So for now, just understand that from PCT, where maximum reabsorption has happened, the filtrate comes to the Henle's loop where water and ionic balance is maintained. How? Because in the descending loop, it is permeable to water, so it allows passage of water, so water is lost from the filtrate, so the filtrate becomes more concentrated. Then the concentrated filtrate moves up the ascending limb, which is permeable only to the ions, so it tends to lose ions. As a result, the filtrate again becomes diluted, and after this it enters into the distal convoluted tubule, which is again another coiled tubule. Here again some reabsorption will happen. So what reabsorption takes place here? Like reabsorption of ions like sodium ions, water. If some more water can be reabsorbed, then that is done here. Some absorption of bicarbonate ions. So all these small reabsorption take place in the distal convoluted tubule. Now here not much reabsorption happens because majorly reabsorption has already taken place in the PCT. And then the last one, that is the collecting duct. Here large amount of reabsorption of water occurs. No major reabsorption of ions, but mostly the reabsorption of water, because after it comes out of the ascending limb, the filtrate is again dilute. So from that dilute filtrate in this distal convoluted tubule, some ion reabsorption happen. So it is still dilute. So this diluted urine is made more concentrated by reabsorption of water, and as a result, the urine which is produced is quite concentrated. So this is the role of the different tubules in the process of reabsorption. Thank you. Please visit www.examfear.com to watch more videos, attempt free online test, get free study material, find tutors and mentors. Thank you once again.